that's the festival this year. And we are really looking forward because last year we were coming back. This year, we're back. And so we're very happy. I would now like to introduce Steve Paikin. It is our absolute pleasure that Steve Paikin is here at Lakefield College School at the Lakefield Literary Festival. Steve has been a journalist for more than 40 years and is the author of 8 books. He's been the anchor of TVO's flagship current affairs program, The Agenda with Steve Paikin, since 2006. So we are here this evening to talk with Steve about this book, his 8th book. It's called John Turner, An Intimate Biography of Canada's 17th Prime Minister. But we're also going to use that as a vehicle through which we can get to a discussion of our current state of political affairs. So, which may make for some interesting conversation, at least I hope so. And to kick us off, you've written 8 books. I've read them all. And
I'm so sorry.
I'm the one. And they're all about politicians. What is with this fascination with politicians?
Okay, I hate to do this on the very first question, but they're not actually all about politicians. One's about hockey, one's about a Holocaust survivor. So 6 out of 8 are about, you're right, 6 out of 8
politicians.
Are about politicians. So I don't know, I grew up in Hamilton, Ontario. My parents were never partisan people. Somebody give it a little cheer there for Hamilton. That's great, wow. Oski Wheeler,
Ask me where I was born.
Hamilton.
In the Hamilton.
And so is Michael Rosen.
Yeah, Michael Rosen's here too, yeah. My parents were not partisan people, but they were always sort of active around politics, and we knew a bunch of politicians, and I guess something just took. I'm very interested in what they do.
Fantastic. I love the idea that you like politicians and you treat them with respect. When you have someone on your show that is of one color or the other color or the other color, I don't care if they're green or orange or red or blue, you treat them all with respect and the dignity they deserve because they're public servants, and I think viewers really appreciate that. Let's start talking about Mr. Turner. Throughout his political career, and certainly when being compared at the time to contemporaries such as Pierre Trudeau, many people wrote him off as a jock. And perhaps you could tell us a little bit about his early athleticism, his early life, but also his education, to let us know, do you think that was fair that he be characterized in that way?
You know, I'm so glad you brought this up because, if you ask people, John Turner, Pierre Trudeau, which one is the Rhodes Scholar? Everybody would say Trudeau, but in fact it's Turner. Which one was the great athlete? Everybody would say Trudeau, because he's got this image in your mind of a canoeist and a swimmer and so on. In fact, John Turner was the fastest man in Canada in the 1940s. He would have represented us at the Olympics in 1948, but he got into a car accident. Oh, isn't that timely? He got into a car accident before the games, and he wrecked his knee, and as a result, he couldn't race for Canada in those games. But it just goes to show you the image that he had, and he didn't actually mind, because he was a hail fellow, well-met kind of guy. He was a backslapping guy. He loved people. He was extroverted. Pierre Trudeau, I wouldn't say he was a backslapping kind of guy who was extroverted. He was the exact opposite. But John Turner does have, and he did have certainly when he first ran for the leadership, he had this kind of knock on him that he was too much of a jock and too much of an airhead, and those were both unfair characterizations.
Absolutely. Let's start his political career then. I want to ask you 2 questions in one. One, there's an old aphorism that politics is show business for ugly people. And
Jeff Leal being a notable exception.
Notable exception to people that I've introduced. But this is not an ugly man. So that's one thing. The guy had movie star looks coming out in his public life just a couple of years after President Kennedy was elected in the United States. Another guy with movie star looks. The second question tied to that is he first came to national attention when he danced with Princess Margaret.
Yes.
So those 2 questions together, if he didn't look like he did, if he didn't dance with Princess Margaret and all of the other rumors that followed that dance, would we even be talking about him today?
the Princess Margaret thing happened because his mother was married to, it was her second husband, the Lieutenant Governor of British Columbia. And he asked his stepson John, we have a royal visit happening, and could you please chaperone Princess Margaret around? And, you know, you can imagine the two of them on the dance floor just cutting an absolutely beautiful picture, which was on the front page of every paper in the country the next day. This is the late 1950s, I guess. There's a double-edged sword about John Turner's looks. On the one hand, there is a woman quoted in this book who was a former female member of Parliament who once said, I would kick John Turner out of bed for eating crackers, but I'd screw him before he hit the floor. So there's that. On the other hand, because he was absolutely so drop-dead gorgeous, with these Frank Sinatra-like blue eyes, he raised expectations in the public's mind about what he could achieve, and he could never meet those expectations. So it was a dual-edged sword for him.
Yeah. Interesting. And you say that comment. There's another comment that you would never get away with now.
Right.
But in those days, you could get away with it. So in December 1967, John Turner was appointed to Lester Pearson's cabinet. And all of a sudden, he is the rising star. If he wasn't before, he certainly was now, because now he's, in his early 30s, and he's a cabinet minister already. And the newspapers notice the looks. They already notice him because of the dance. And just a few months later, Pearson resigns, or announces he's going to resign. It's going to be a leadership contest. So my question is, again, double-edged, I guess. What made a guy that young, that relatively inexperienced, think he had what it took to lead the party, and if he won, he was going to become prime minister? Tied to that, what would lead anybody to think that the country needs me? What is it that gets into a person's head that they say, I have what it takes to lead the party and lead the country?
I think, I'm just going with the first thing that pops into my head. And the first thing that pops into my head is a quote from a guy who they're going to bury tomorrow.
Yeah.
Brian Mulrooney once said to me in an interview, you have to have a certain capacity for self-delusion or you never get out of bed in the morning. and that was his view. There are days in politics where the whole world hates you, and if you don't have a capacity to believe that you are capable of great things, as he says, you wouldn't get out of bed in the morning. John Turner was not crazy for thinking that he potentially had something, good on offer for the country at that time. You have to remember, Pierre Trudeau, who of course ends up winning the '68 Leadership Convention, has only been a Liberal MP for 3 years. He's very new to the party. Mr. Turner thinks at the time that Mr. Trudeau doesn't really have much of an organization because he hasn't been in the party very long. Trudeau-mania was still to come, but it hadn't happened quite yet. In addition, John Turner's, I think, 39 years old, 38, 39 when he runs for the leadership. And he really puts himself out there as the choice of the next generation. And there are a lot of other people in the race. Robert Winters was in the race, Paul Martin Sr. was in the race, a bunch of other players who were, Paul Hellyer was in the race. Most of them sort of evoked yesterday's man. Turner was the one guy in the race who actually evoked tomorrow's man. And it was so interesting, when he ran in that leadership convention in 1968, he said, because he knew his age was a handicap, he knew people were looking at him and saying, John, not this time, maybe next time, you're too young. And he would say in his speech on the night, I'm not running for some future convention in 1984, I'm running for now. And ironically enough, he won the convention in 1984 to become Liberal leader. And he said it in '68. It's one of those crazy kind of confluences of history.
He saw it coming. Now, Trudeau had the brains to put Mr. Turner, who was a star. And so what have we lost? What do you think we've lost as a result of that? In our public discourse, in how bills get passed, what have we lost?
We've certainly lost some of the secret sauce that allowed a more collegial political atmosphere to work together and to make stuff happen. I'm not saying it never happens today, it does happen today. And I bet Jeff Leal could tell stories about there were moments in his political life when he was at Queen's Park where things were more collegial than you might expect. So they may be more collegial than you might expect, but they're not as collegial as they ought to be, or as they were. And I just think, you talk about John Turner when he was Minister of Justice, having people in to look at the bill, and and the opposition critics saying, I can't do this. Maybe if you can give me a little bit here, I can give you a little bit there. I'd like to think that still happens. Maybe it does a bit with some ministers, but not like it did back then.
And it's a shame, I think.
Yeah.
Okay, you mentioned about Turner, and I guess I mentioned about Turner, and how bills get passed. Let's talk about a bill that passed when he was Justice Minister. One of the most significant bills, I think, in Canadian history. Bill 150. And it did a number of things, and among the things that it did, it decriminalized abortion, and it decriminalized divorce. And if you think that the Americans are still fighting about this, and we had this settled two generations ago. Now, my question though is, John Turner was a devout Catholic.
Yes.
He very serious about his faith, and yet here he is championing a bill which, among its changes, was making actions that were against his faith. How could he square that? And how do other public figures square that when they are put in similar positions?
It may surprise you to hear this, but John Turner read the Bible every day. And when he finished, he'd start again. And he'd read it through again and again and again. He was a very staunch Catholic, as you point out, but he understood that his public responsibilities and his private beliefs may not be the same thing, but as long as he was going to be the Minister of Justice, he had to give precedence to what his Prime Minister, his party, his government expected. And he couldn't have taken the job unless he understood that, and he did. And actually, there was another thing on that list. Yes, John Turner was the Justice Minister responsible for the omnibus bill that, among other things, amended the criminal code to make abortion under some circumstances legal. It was illegal in Canada. He liberalized it. He represented the first attempt at liberalizing the abortion laws in Canada. Regardless of what your position is on that issue, I think most polls show that Canadians are overwhelmingly in favor of more liberalized abortion laws. That was significant. If you can imagine this, if you wanted a divorce 55 years ago in this country, you had to go to the Parliament of Canada and make your case. And a committee studied it, and Parliament had to okay it. That's the way it was. No longer, after John Turner got those criminal code amendments through. There was one more really significant thing in that bill as well, John, and that was homosexuality.
That's right.
Which was illegal in Canada at that time. And, for a staunch Catholic, Mr. Turner was actually quite a champion of LGBTQ rights. I'm sure it wasn't described that way at the time, but in the fullness of time, that's what you've got. And, again, regardless of what you think about these issues, these were historic achievements.
Mm-hmm. And yet often it is Pierre Trudeau who, when he was Justice Minister, who began this bill, is credited for the bill, despite the fact...
Well, because he had the great line.
Yes. And the great line was...
We all know the line. There you go. You all know it. Yeah, the state has no place in the bedrooms of the nation. So... In fairness to Mr. Trudeau, who, when he was Justice Minister for Lester Pearson, tried to get the same bill through, but couldn't, it was a minority parliament. When Trudeau came in '68, they had a majority parliament. He could essentially do what he wanted under those circumstances. It certainly made it easier for John Turner to get it through, but the fact that he had friends on all sides of the House, I think, contributed to that bill getting through the way it did as well. So John Turner, I won't say he grew up in poverty, but he certainly didn't grow up the son of a multimillionaire, which Pierre Trudeau did.
That's right.
And didn't inherit, $1 million trust fund when he was 13 years old, as Pierre Trudeau did. So that family worked its way up, hard scrabble, worked its way up. Anyway, back to 1975. Turner wants this closer relationship with Trudeau. Trudeau, for whatever reason, can't give it to him. And as a result, there were lots of kind of missed signals, miscommunication. Trudeau, at one point in the meeting, offers Turner a position on the Supreme Court of Canada. and then a position in the Senate. And Turner's thinking to himself, why is he trying to put me out to pasture? That's not what I want. I want a closer relationship with him. I want to be, closer to the decision making of the government. So it just didn't work. And as a result, he walked out, front door 24 Sussex, a mob of reporters waiting for him, and announced his resignation. Now, if you want to understand how big a deal this was, think about today if Chrystia Freeland did that to Justin Trudeau. And no one saw it coming. I mean, it would be massive news. And in fact, I think it took so much wind out of Liberal sails, particularly in the province of Ontario, because there was a provincial election in '75 a week later, and the Liberals were well on their way to beating Bill Davis after just one term. And Mr. Davis managed to come back, and Liberal fortunes sagged in that election. The Liberals actually came third in that election, and a lot of people think it's because of all of what was going on around John Turner. It had such a profoundly devastating effect on Liberal fortunes federally, and as it turned out, provincially as well. Jill Turner, bore and raised his 4 children, put her aspirations on hold to be the wife of a cabinet minister and partake in all of what that involves when you live in a one-company town like Ottawa. Left Ottawa, moved to Toronto, led a fabulous life. You point out the kind of life they had in Toronto. They had a fantastic house in Forest Hill, fabulous parties, fabulous restaurants, kids are going to the best schools. They really had a great time. And when the pressure in 1984 for John to get back into public life came, her attitude was, we kind of been there and done that. I guess I got to be a good sport and get behind him and let him see it through. But it clearly was not her first choice. And what made things even worse is that he wasn't very good when he came back into public life. And she didn't like a lot of what the advisors around him were advising. And because of that, I think it made her crazy. I think when I say crazy, I mean frustrated as hell. I think she saw things going wrong that she thought, damn it, you're getting let down by your staff all the time, which contributed to her disaffection with politics. And so she was not his Rock of Gibraltar, and he needed one. And unfortunately for him, it wasn't her at that time. For understandable reasons, in my view.
Interesting. So you mentioned that he was, I don't know if you used the word, but you certainly used it in the book. When he came back to public life, he'd been out for a decade.
Yep.
He was rusty.
Oh, yeah.
And that was the word that you used in the book. And I'm wondering, I'm going to push back a little bit here, if I could be so bold.
Do it. Let's do it.
Say, maybe he wasn't rusty at all. Maybe this was simply a man who found himself out of his time. His time had passed him by. And the one moment that I want to illustrate that belief or that premise with is the bump pat that was heard around the world.
I knew you were going there.
Maybe you could explain the story for those who don't know, and did this show that he was not just rusty? This is a man who belonged to another era.
Well, he did belong to another era. That's absolutely fair to say, and it gets back to what I said earlier about never having a father. He has no first-hand memories of his father. So during the course of his, at first legal career, then political career, John Turner was always very attracted to father figures. They played a significant role in his life. And as a result, yes, there was a bit of a kind of a yesterday's man quality to him. I think that's fair to say. He used to wear these very high-cut suits that were not consistent with the 1980s. Now, if you're good, you can get over that. They said Jean Chrétien was yesterday's man as well when he came back and won the Liberal leadership in 1993. And somehow he figured out that, being yesterday's man wasn't so bad. He won 3 straight elections. But for John Turner, he never quite figured it out. Sean Conway, whom some of you will know in this room, former Ontario cabinet minister, said when he came back to public life, he just wasn't tournament tough. Rusty he was. He just was not ready. And one of the things, I see some younger people here tonight who will be shocked that this actually happened. But John Turner, we talked about, he was a bit of a jockey guy. He's a very tactile guy. He patted guys on the back, he patted guys on the butt, he patted women on the butt. And he didn't think anything of it. And the problem was you could get away with that in the 60s and maybe the 70s, but by the time 1984 comes along and you're the leader of the Liberal Party of Canada, you can't do that anymore.
Especially to the president of the Liberal Party.
Especially to the president of the Liberal Party, whose name was Iona Campanola, and he did it to her as they were leaving an announcement together. And you know what she did? She did it back to him. And then he said to her, with cameras and microphones around, "You've been waiting to do that for a long time, haven't you?" Like, he kind of liked that body humor. But that kind of stuff was in the mid-1980s, that was already becoming problematic.
The media often name the buses or name the planes. Do you remember the name that the media gave to the Liberal campaign plane?
In the 84 election?
Derry Air.
Derry Air.